Life with Linda wasn't just good. It was everything I'd ever wanted. We'd been married for 8 years, and while I wouldn't say it was perfect, we had our own rhythm. You know, the kind of marriage where you can predict each other's moves like a well-rehearsed dance. She was the kind of woman who could command a room with her presence. People would say to me, "You're so lucky to have her." And they weren't wrong. I was lucky. We had a nice house, too. A cozy little 3-bedroom on a quiet street. Nothing too fancy, but it was ours. We'd sit on the couch at night, watching movies, joking about the silly things our neighbors did, and dreaming up plans for the future. It felt like we were on the same page, you know? Partners. But then, things started changing. And not in a way you'd immediately notice. It was subtle at first, her coming home a little later than usual. "Work's been crazy," she'd say. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Linda was always ambitious, throwing herself into her career with everything she had. But it didn't stop there. She became distracted. I'd be talking to her about my day, and she'd nod absent-mindedly, her eyes flicking to her phone every few minutes. At first, I didn't think much of it. We're all glued to our phones these days, right? But there was something about her expression. A flicker of guilt when I caught her typing out a text too quickly or turning her screen away from me. That made me pause. One night, I heard her on the phone after dinner. Her voice was softer than usual, almost playful. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. When she hung up, I asked her who it was. "Oh, just a colleague," she said, smiling that easy smile of hers. But her eyes didn't match the smile. I didn't push her. Maybe I should have. But you don't want to believe something's wrong, do you? You cling to the idea that everything's fine, even when the cracks are starting to show. That's the thing about cracks. They start small. You can almost ignore them. But eventually, they spread. And before you know it, the whole thing comes crashing down around you. You know how they say you should trust your gut? Well, my gut started screaming at me a few weeks after that strange phone call. I didn't want to admit it, but something wasn't right. Linda was still coming home late, still glued to her phone, and still giving me that same distracted, half-present energy. And the excuses? Oh, they just kept piling up. Another work meeting. Traffic was insane. Or, my personal favorite, I lost track of time at the gym. Now I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, but you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to know when something's off. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't going to look. Honestly, I wasn't. But when I glanced over, the name on the screen wasn't one I recognized. Jackson. The message read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." I felt my stomach drop. My hands got clammy. For a second, I just stood there staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Jackson? Who the hell was Jackson, and what exactly couldn't he wait for? When Linda came out of the shower, I didn't say a word. I just pretended everything was fine. But inside? Oh, I was a mess. My mind was racing with questions I didn't have the courage to ask. Instead, I decided to play it cool and figure things out on my own. The next day, I left work early and decided to follow her. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I parked a few blocks away from her office and waited. Around 6 p.m., I saw her walk out. Not towards the parking lot, but down the street. My heart was pounding as I followed at a safe distance, trying not to let her see me. And that's when I saw him. Jackson. He was tall, muscular, the kind of guy who walks like he owns the world. He had this flashy grin, and when Linda walked up to him, he greeted her with a hug that lingered way too long for my comfort. They laughed, talked, and then got into his car. I followed them to a small restaurant across town. They sat at a table near the window, smiling and leaning in close like they were on a date. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some colleague or gym buddy. I felt a mix of anger and humiliation rising in my chest. I wanted to burst into that restaurant, flip the table, and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel, watching as my wife laughed at another man's jokes. When they left, I followed them again. They didn't go to his place or some shady motel, though. No, they went to a park. They sat on a bench, talking for what felt like hours. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way she looked at him, that told me everything I needed to know. When Linda finally came home that night, I was sitting on the couch, waiting. She gave me her usual excuse. Work ran late. I just nodded, pretending to believe her, but inside, something had snapped. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Jackson's smug face, Linda's laughter, and that stupid little wink in the text message. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You know, I told myself I'd confront Linda. I even rehearsed it in my head. Calm, rational, mature. But every time I saw her, that image of her with Jackson in the park stopped me cold. She'd walk into the house like nothing had happened, kiss me on the cheek, and ask about my day as if everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. A week after I saw them together, Linda dropped a bombshell on me. "I've invited Jackson over," she said casually, like she was talking about a neighbor or a family friend. I blinked at her. "Jackson? The guy you've been spending so much time with?" Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. "He's just a friend. I thought it might be nice for you two to meet. Maybe you'll see there's nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about? She didn't even try to hide the fact that she'd been seeing him. And now she wanted me to meet him? I wanted to refuse. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to say no, but something in her tone, almost daring me to push back, made me agree. Fine. If she wanted me to meet Jackson, I'd meet him. The day he came over, I was ready, or so I thought. The moment he walked into my house, though, I knew exactly what kind of man he was. He was tall, built like a bodybuilder, and radiated this smug, arrogant energy that made me want to punch him on the spot. He shook my hand with just a little too much force, flashing me a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Nice place," he said, looking around like he owned it. "Thanks," I said, my voice tight. "It's home." Linda hovered around him like a moth to a flame, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm, and completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting right there. And Jackson? Oh, he loved every second of it. He made himself comfortable quickly, sprawling on my couch like it was his. He made comments about my furniture, my taste in art, even the way I arranged my bookshelves. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked as he propped his feet up on my coffee table. I stared at him, forcing myself to stay calm. "Actually, I do." That got his attention. For a moment, his grin faltered and he gave me a look. One of those condescending, "What are you going to do about it?" looks. But it wasn't just his behavior that got to me. It was Linda. She didn't say a word to defend me. Instead, she laughed nervously and told me to relax. Relax? In my own house? With this guy disrespecting me left and right? The worst part came later that evening. We were sitting at the dinner table when Jackson leaned back in his chair and said, "Linda tells me you're not much into working out." I clenched my jaw. "I stay active." "Sure," he said, smirking. "But you don't lift, right? I mean, it's fine. Not everyone's cut out for it." Linda chuckled softly, and I felt something inside me snap. But I didn't let it show. Not yet. The rest of the evening was a blur of subtle digs and veiled insults. By the time Jackson left, I was exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. As I watched him swagger down my driveway, I made a decision. This guy thought he was an alpha male, thought he could waltz into my house and make me feel small. But he had no idea who he was messing with. I wasn't going to let him win. Not in my house. Not ever. After that dinner, something in me shifted. You see, I'm not a violent man. never have been. But there's a limit to how much disrespect a man can take, especially in his own home. Jackson thought he had me pegged, a quiet, soft-spoken guy who wouldn't dare stand up to him. And Linda? She was too caught up in whatever fantasy Jackson was selling to see what was happening right under her nose. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to argue. No, I was going to play the long game. If Jackson wanted to play alpha, I'd show him what real strategy looked like. The first step was observation. I started paying closer attention to him, how he moved, how he spoke, and most importantly, how he thought. The guy was cocky, overconfident, and reckless. He had no idea I was watching, quietly analyzing every weakness he didn't even know he had. Linda didn't make it hard either. She talked about him constantly, dropping little details here and there. "Jackson's got a big workout competition coming up," she'd say. Or, "He's been training for weeks. He's so focused." Focused, huh? Good. That meant his pride was tied to his strength. And if there's one thing I know about guys like Jackson, it's that their egos are their Achilles heel. I bided my time, keeping my anger in check. Meanwhile, I started preparing the house. Little things Jackson wouldn't notice but would make all the difference later. For example, I rearranged some of the tools in the garage and moved a few heavy objects out of plain sight. And then there was Linda. I knew confronting her would be tricky, but I couldn't let her off the hook completely. One night, after another one of Jackson's visits, I sat her down. "Do you even see what's happening here?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She looked at me, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Jackson," I said bluntly. "He's disrespecting me in my house, and you're letting him." She hesitated, biting her lip. "He's not doing anything wrong. You're just being paranoid." Paranoid. Right. That's what she thought. Fine. If she wasn't going to help me, I'd handle it myself. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, Linda casually mentioned that Jackson was coming over to hang out. Hang out? In my house? Again? I smiled and said, "Sure, sounds great." What Jackson didn't know was that I'd spent the entire day getting ready for him. When he arrived, he strutted into my house like he owned the place, tossing his jacket on the couch and making a beeline for the fridge without even asking. "You got any beer?" he asked, flashing that infuriating grin. "Help yourself," I said, watching him carefully. We sat down to chat. Well, Jackson chatted. I just let him run his mouth, all the while noting his arrogance, the way he assumed I was too weak to challenge him. He started bragging about his latest workout routine, throwing in a few not-so-subtle digs about my lack of physicality. "You ever thought about lifting, man?" he asked, flexing his biceps. "Might do you some good." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. Maybe. Or maybe I've got other ways of staying strong. He laughed, clearly not understanding the double meaning. But that was fine. He didn't need to understand yet. That night, as Jackson left, I walked him to the door and said, "Hey, you should come by tomorrow. We can have a proper talk, man to man." He grinned. "Sure thing. Let's see if you can keep up." Keep up? Oh, I plan to do more than that. Tomorrow, Jackson was going to learn what happens when you underestimate a man in his own home. When Jackson agreed to come over the next day, I knew the moment had arrived. I'd been patient, biding my time, but enough was enough. This wasn't just about Jackson anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my house, and my life. The morning started like any other. Linda left for work early, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I spent the day preparing for what I knew would be a confrontation. My plan wasn't just about brute strength. I wasn't foolish enough to think I could outmuscle Jackson, but about turning his arrogance against him. By the time evening rolled around, I was ready. Jackson swaggered into my house as if he owned the place, greeting me with his usual cocky grin. "What's up, man?" he said, slapping me on the back like we were old buddies. "Not much," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "Thought we'd have a little talk." "Talk?" he said, raising an eyebrow. Sure, man, whatever you need. We headed down to the basement where I'd set up a small workout area. Jackson looked around, smirking. Didn't peg you for a gym guy, he said, flexing his biceps for emphasis. I dabble, I replied, gesturing for him to sit. He plopped down on one of the weight benches, stretching his arms behind his head. So, what's this about? You want to talk about Linda? His smirk was the final straw. Something like that, I said. I stepped closer, towering over him. I know what you're doing, Jackson. You've been walking into my house, disrespecting me and trying to take over. And you think I'm just going to let that slide? He laughed, a low, mocking sound that made my blood boil. Let it slide? What are you going to do about it, man? His arrogance was exactly what I'd been counting on. You've been underestimating me, Jackson, I said, my voice calm but firm. You think you're the alpha here, but let me show you something. Before he could react, I knocked the weight bar off its stand, sending it crashing to the floor beside him. He jumped up, startled, his bravado slipping for the first time. What the hell, man? He said, stepping back. This is my house, I said, my voice rising. Not yours, not Linda's, mine. And if you think you can walk in here and bully me, you've got another thing coming. Jackson's face twisted in anger. You think you can intimidate me? You're nothing, man. A weak little... He didn't get to finish. I lunged, catching him off guard. The fight wasn't pretty. Jackson was strong, but his strength was useless against someone who was prepared. I used every trick I'd planned, every advantage I'd set up in advance. The basement became a battlefield, weights and equipment crashing to the floor as we grappled. And then it happened. Jackson tried to charge me, but I sidestepped, sending him stumbling into a stack of dumbbells. He lost his footing, his legs giving out as he crashed to the floor with a sickening crack. He screamed in pain, clutching his legs. I stood over him, breathing hard. This is over, Jackson. You're done coming into my house. You're done disrespecting me, and you're done with Linda. His screams turned to groans as he tried to move, but the damage was done. His so-called alpha status was shattered, just like his legs. I called an ambulance, ensuring he'd get medical attention. But as the paramedics arrived, Jackson's smug confidence was gone, replaced by fear and humiliation. Linda came home just as they were wheeling him out. Her face went pale as she took in the scene, her eyes darting between Jackson and me. What happened? She whispered. I looked at her, my voice cold. Your boyfriend learned the hard way that this is my house. She didn't say a word. For the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely shaken. But this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of the fallout that would change everything. The silence after Jackson was taken away was deafening. Linda stood in the doorway, her face pale and her lips trembling. She looked at me, then at the bloodstain on the basement floor, and back at me. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. What did you do? I didn't answer right away. I was still catching my breath, still riding the adrenaline. Instead, I walked past her, up the stairs, and into the living room. She followed me, her steps hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the truth. When I finally turned to face her, she looked smaller somehow, fragile almost. But I wasn't going to let her play the victim, not after everything. What did I do? I repeated, my voice cold. I defended myself. I defended this house. And I defended my dignity, Linda. Something you should have been doing instead of bringing that man into our lives. Her eyes welled up with tears, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. You broke his legs, she said, her voice shaking. You could have killed him. And he could have done worse to me, I shot back. Do you even understand the kind of man you let into our home? Do you even care what he's done to me, to us? Her tears fell then, but they weren't the kind of tears that come from regret or remorse. They were the tears of someone caught in their own web. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her voice cracking. Oh, so you did mean for it to go somewhere, I said bitterly. Tell me, Linda, when you started sneaking around with Jackson, when you started bringing him here, did you ever stop to think about me? About our marriage? Or was I just some obstacle in your way? She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know, she mumbled. I stood there staring at her, waiting for something, anything, that would make sense of the betrayal. But all she could offer was silence. Here's what's going to happen, I said finally, my voice hard and unyielding. You're going to explain to me how we got here. Every detail. No more lies, no more excuses. I want the truth, Linda. All of it. She looked up at me then, her face streaked with tears. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said. I was lonely. You've been so distant, so caught up in your own world. I just wanted to feel alive again. Alive? I repeated, my anger boiling over. So you brought a predator into our house? You let him mock me, humiliate me in my own home? That's how you fix things, Linda? By tearing me down? I didn't think he'd go this far, she yelled, her voice breaking. I didn't think. No, you didn't think, I interrupted, my voice cutting through hers. You didn't think about me, about us, about anything but yourself. And now, look where we are. Look at what you've done. The room fell silent again, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Linda wiped her eyes, her voice a whisper. What happens now? I stared at her for a long moment, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to walk out that door and never look back. But another part, the part that still remembered the good times, the love we'd shared, wanted to fight for what we had. I don't know, I admitted. But this isn't something we just move past. You need to decide, Linda. Are you willing to fix this? To earn back my trust? Because if you're not, I'm done. She nodded slowly, her tears falling again. I'll do whatever it takes. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The cracks in our marriage weren't just cracks anymore. They were fractures, deep and jagged. And no matter how hard we tried, I wasn't sure if they could ever truly be mended. The days after the confrontation were tense, to put it mildly. Linda and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was awkward and strained. She tiptoed around me like I was a bomb ready to explode, and maybe I was. I didn't know how to process everything that had happened. The betrayal, the fight with Jackson, the look on her face when she saw him being wheeled out of the house. The neighbors started talking, of course. It wasn't every day you saw an ambulance pull up and take a man out of a house on a stretcher. Linda made up some story about Jackson being a family friend who had an accident while helping us with some heavy lifting. I didn't bother correcting her. Let her spin whatever tale she needed to save face. Meanwhile, I had my own battles to fight. Jackson, being the arrogant fool he was, decided to press charges. I found out when a police officer showed up at the door asking questions about the incident. I told them the truth. Jackson had come at me, and I defended myself. Thankfully, the officer seemed to believe me. But that didn't stop Jackson. He sent me a message through a mutual acquaintance, threatening to make my life hell. I laughed when I heard that. He might have thought he was still in control, but he wasn't. Not anymore. Linda, on the other hand, was falling apart. I caught her crying more than once, and while part of me wanted to comfort her, another part couldn't forget what she'd done. She tried to apologize over and over, but the words felt hollow. I made a mistake, she said one night, her voice trembling. I don't know why I let things get so far. I was stupid and I hurt you, but I want to make it right. Do you? I asked, my tone sharp. Or are you just sorry because it all blew up in your face? She didn't answer, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. The tension reached its peak a week later when Jackson had the audacity to show up at our house. I was in the living room when I saw his car pull into the driveway. My blood boiled. The man could barely walk. His legs were in casts. But there he was, hobbling out of his car, leaning on crutches like some tragic hero. Linda opened the door before I could stop her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I came to talk," Jackson said, his tone dripping with fake sincerity. "You've done enough talking," I said, stepping into the doorway. "Get off my property." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over," he said. "You think you've won, but you haven't." I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "I broke your legs, Jackson. Don't make me regret stopping there." He glared at me for a moment, then turned and hobbled back to his car. Linda closed the door and leaned against it, her face pale. "I didn't ask him to come," she whispered. "Doesn't matter," I said. "He's your mess, Linda, and I'm done cleaning it up." After that, something shifted between us. Linda started going out of her way to prove she was committed to fixing things, cooking dinner every night, leaving me little notes, even suggesting we go to couples therapy. But no matter what she did, I couldn't shake the anger, the humiliation. One night, I told her as much. "You can't just erase what you did, Linda. You let that man into our lives, into our home. You let him disrespect me, and you didn't do a thing to stop it." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm begging you, please don't give up on us." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. The truth was, I wasn't sure if there was still an us left to save. After Jackson's dramatic exit in an ambulance, the house was silent. Too silent. Linda didn't say a word as she stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, staring at the empty space where Jackson had just been wheeled out. I, on the other hand, felt the adrenaline drain out of me, leaving behind an emptiness I couldn't explain. I'd defended myself, sure, but at what cost? Linda finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to hurt him like that." I turned to her, my voice calm but firm. "He came into my house, Linda. What did you expect me to do? Let him bully me? Humiliate me again?" Her eyes welled up with tears, but I wasn't in the mood for her guilt-ridden theatrics. Not this time. "You don't get to cry about this," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "You let this happen. You brought him into our lives, into our home. Don't act like you're the victim here." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead, she nodded silently and walked away, retreating to the bedroom. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fight in my head over and over again. Jackson's smug face, his taunts, the way he tried to assert his dominance in my own house, it all swirled in my mind like a storm. But what bothered me even more was Linda's silence. Her refusal to take any responsibility for what had happened was like a knife twisting in my gut. The next few days were a blur of awkward interactions and avoidance. Linda tiptoed around me, barely saying more than a few words at a time. When she did speak, it was in a strained, apologetic tone that only made things worse. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said one morning as we sat at the breakfast table. I looked up from my coffee, meeting her eyes for the first time in days. "You keep saying that, but it doesn't change anything. You brought him into our lives, Linda. You let him walk all over me, and now you're acting like you're surprised it ended this way?" She opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. That day, I got a call from one of the neighbors. Apparently, the ambulance scene hadn't gone unnoticed, and now the whole street was buzzing with gossip. "What happened?" they asked, their tone dripping with curiosity. "Is everything okay?" "It's fine," I said curtly, brushing them off. But inside, I felt a pang of embarrassment. This wasn't just about Linda and Jackson anymore. This was about my reputation, my dignity. The thought of people whispering about me, speculating about what had happened in my own home, made my skin crawl. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Linda and me only grew. She tried to make amends in small ways, cooking my favorite meals, leaving me notes apologizing for her mistakes, even suggesting couples therapy. But no matter what she did, I couldn't shake the anger and betrayal that hung between us like a dark cloud. One evening, I caught her crying in the living room. She looked up when she saw me, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe you can't," I replied coldly, walking past her without another word. The truth was, I didn't know if I even wanted her to fix it. The cracks in our marriage weren't just cracks anymore. They were fractures, deep and jagged. And every time I looked at her, I saw Jackson's smug face, heard his mocking laugh. Linda, for all her efforts, didn't seem to understand that some things can't be undone. Some lines, once crossed, leave scars that never fully heal. By the end of the week, I'd made a decision. I wasn't ready to leave, yet, but I also wasn't ready to forgive. Not until I'd figured out where we stood and whether there was anything left worth saving. Linda sensed the shift in me, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she kept her distance, waiting for me to make the next move. Little did either of us know, the next move wouldn't come from me, or from her. It would come from Jackson. Just when I thought the storm had passed, Jackson proved he wasn't the type to slink away quietly. I should have known better. A man like him, arrogant, entitled, and vindictive, wasn't going to let this go without a fight. And sure enough, his next move arrived a few days later, wrapped up in the form of legal papers. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing my second cup of coffee, when the knock came at the door. Linda opened it, and I could hear a low murmur of voices. A minute later, she walked into the room, holding a manila envelope, her face pale. "It's for you," she said, setting the envelope on the table. I opened it, already feeling the tension creep into my shoulders. Inside was a lawsuit filed by Jackson, accusing me of assault and unprovoked violence. He claimed I had lured him into my home and attacked him without cause. The audacity of it made my blood boil. "Can you believe this?" I said, tossing the papers onto the table. "Unprovoked violence? He came into my house, Linda. He threatened me. He tried to bully me, and now he's playing the victim." Linda sat down across from me, wringing her hands. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "I'll tell you what we're not going to do," I said firmly. "We're not going to let him get away with this." I called a lawyer that afternoon. I wasn't going to let Jackson's lies tarnish my name or paint me as the aggressor. If he wanted a fight, he was going to get one. But on my terms. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and court dates. Linda, to her credit, testified on my behalf. She admitted that Jackson had been aggressive, that he'd made threats, and that I had only acted in self-defense. But even with her testimony, the stress of the situation took its toll on both of us. The court case dragged on longer than I expected. Jackson, ever the manipulator, played up his injuries for sympathy. He arrived in court with both legs in casts, leaning heavily on crutches, his expression one of exaggerated pain. He painted himself as the victim, spinning a story that made me look like a crazed, jealous husband who had lashed out in a fit of rage. But my lawyer was sharp, and we had the truth on our side. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera showed Jackson entering my house willingly, laughing and joking as he walked inside. It was a stark contrast to his courtroom persona, and it poked significant holes in his story. The turning point came when Jackson's own arrogance betrayed him. During cross-examination, he couldn't resist gloating about how he had challenged me, practically admitting that he had been the aggressor all along. The judge didn't take kindly to his attitude, and by the end of the trial, the lawsuit was dismissed. Even though I'd technically won, the victory felt hollow. The whole ordeal had drained me, emotionally, financially, and mentally. Jackson may have been out of my life for good, but the damage he'd caused lingered like a shadow over everything. Linda tried to celebrate the dismissal of the case, but I couldn't bring myself to join her. "It's over," she said one night, her voice tinged with hope. "We can finally move on." I stared at her, my expression unreadable. "Is it, though?" I asked, "because I don't think things will ever go back to the way they were." She didn't have an answer for that, and honestly, neither did I. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a strange new normal. Linda and I coexisted in the same house, but the warmth and intimacy that had once defined our marriage were gone. She tried her best to make amends, but no matter what she did, I couldn't shake the bitterness that had taken root in my heart. One evening, as I sat in the living room, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance, someone who had known Jackson long before he entered our lives. "You need to watch your back," they said. "Jackson doesn't let things go. He's already talking about ways to get even." I thanked them for the warning, but I couldn't help feeling a twinge of frustration. Even after the lawsuit, Jackson still wasn't done. The man was like a parasite, clinging to anything that would feed his ego. Linda noticed the tension in me that night. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Nothing," I said, brushing her off. I didn't want to involve her in this anymore. She'd already done enough damage. But deep down, I knew Jackson wasn't finished. And while I had no idea what his next move might be, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let him win. After the court case and the warning from our mutual acquaintance, life felt like walking on a tightrope. I knew Jackson wasn't the type to let things go, and even though the lawsuit had been dismissed, the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Linda was trying, really trying, to repair the damage she'd done, but every attempt felt like trying to glue back the pieces of a shattered vase. The real question wasn't whether Jackson would come after me again. It was whether my marriage to Linda had any chance of surviving. One evening, Linda approached me in the living room. She looked nervous, wringing her hands like she had something big to say. "I think we should go to therapy," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I know things aren't the same between us, but I want to fix this. I want us to fix this." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Linda, therapy isn't going to erase what's happened. You brought him into our lives. You let him disrespect me, mock me, and you stood by while he tried to take over my home. Do you even realize what that did to me?" "I do," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I realize it every single day. And I hate myself for it. But I love you, and I want to make things right. Please let me try." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could rebuild what had been broken. But every time I looked at her, I saw Jackson's smug face, heard his mocking laugh. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice cold. A few days later, I got another call from the mutual acquaintance who'd warned me about Jackson before. "You need to know something," they said, their tone grim. "Jackson's leaving town. He's apparently got a new gig out of state. But before he goes, he's been bragging about one last hurrah, something to make sure you don't forget him." My blood ran cold. Jackson's vendetta had gone beyond a petty lawsuit or a bruised ego. He wanted revenge, and I couldn't afford to underestimate him. That evening, I sat Linda down. "Jackson's not done," I said bluntly. Her eyes widened in fear. "What do you mean?" "He's planning something," I said. "I don't know what, but he's not going to let this go quietly. I need you to be honest with me, Linda. Has he contacted you?" She hesitated, and my stomach twisted. "He sent me a text a few days ago," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't respond. I swear, I didn't respond." I stared at her, my anger boiling over. "You should have told me." "I was scared," she said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to make things worse. Worse? I shouted. How could it possibly get worse? He's already tried to destroy our lives, and now he's planning something else, and you just kept quiet? Linda broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. But I didn't have time for her guilt. I needed to figure out what Jackson's hurrah was, and fast. 2 nights later, Jackson made his move. It was late, past midnight, when I heard the sound of breaking glass downstairs. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I'd stashed under the bed just in case. "Stay here," I told Linda, who was already trembling in fear. I crept downstairs, my grip tightening on the bat. In the dim light, I saw him, Jackson, his legs still in casts, hobbling around my living room, knocking things over and laughing to himself like a madman. "Jackson," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Get out, now." He turned to face me, his grin smug despite his obvious disadvantage. "What are you gonna do, huh? Break my arms this time?" I didn't reply. Instead, I stepped closer, the bat resting on my shoulder. "You don't scare me," he sneered. "You're just a pathetic little man who couldn't even keep his wife's attention." That was it. The final straw. I lunged, swinging the bat, not at him, but at the wall behind him. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, and Jackson flinched, his bravado faltering for the first time. "This is your last warning," I said, my voice like ice. "You leave now, or the next swing won't miss." For a moment, he just stood there, his face a mix of fear and rage. Then, muttering curses under his breath, he turned and hobbled out of the house. I locked the door behind him, my hands shaking. The next day, I reported the incident to the police. Jackson was arrested for trespassing and harassment, and with his prior behavior on record, he was slapped with a restraining order and a hefty fine. I didn't see or hear from him again after that. As for Linda and me, the damage had already been done. We tried therapy, tried to rebuild, but the cracks in our marriage were too deep. Eventually, we decided to go our separate ways. The day she moved out, she stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." "I know," I said. "Take care of yourself, Linda." And with that, she was gone. Looking back, I realized that Jackson's intrusion into my life wasn't just about him or Linda. It was about me learning where my limits were, learning when to stand up for myself and when to let go. In the end, I didn't just lose a wife. I found something more important: myself.